Christmas Eve, 1944. The radio traffic from Rodion Malinovsky's headquarters crackled with coordinates and unit designations. The 53rd Army pressed from the northeast. The 7th Guards Army drove in from the east. Elements of the 46th Army swung wide to seal the western approaches. Romanian formations, the 7th Romanian Corps among them, plugged gaps in the encirclement that Soviet rifle divisions could not cover. 2 Ukrainian fronts, Malinovsky's 2nd and Fyodor Tolbukin's 3rd, converged on the Hungarian capital with the grinding inevitability of continental plates. By December 26th, Soviet troops severed the main road to Vienna west of the city. The ring closed. Inside that ring, the German NAV SS Mountain Corps, fragments of the Hungarian Topographic Corps, Aero Cross militia, police battalions, and Luftwaffe ground personnel pressed into infantry roles. 70,000 Axis soldiers, nearly 1 million civilians. The Danube bisected their prison, its bridges now the only arteries connecting the eastern districts of Pest to the western hills of Buda. Adolf Hitler's response arrived via encoded transmission to SS Obergruppenführer Karl Pfeffer-Wildenbruch. Budapest was now a Festung, a fortress city. The garrison would hold until relieved. Withdrawal was forbidden. Breakout was forbidden. The word retreat had been excised from operational vocabulary. The strategic calculus appeared almost rational in the sterile grammar of staff memoranda. Southwestern Hungary contained the Nagy-Kanisa petroleum fields, Germany's last significant crude oil source after the loss of Ploiești and the systematic Allied destruction of synthetic fuel plants. By late 1944, Wehrmacht mobility had collapsed. Luftwaffe sorties were rationed by the leader. Every barrel from Nagy-Kanisa represented another panzer that could move, another Messerschmitt that could fly. In Hitler's arithmetic, Budapest shielded those wells. Lose the city, lose the oil. Lose the oil, lose the war. Joseph Stalin operated on a different timeline. The Yalta Conference loomed in February. Budapest's capture would demonstrate Soviet strength, secure Hungary within Moscow's sphere, and present the Western Allies with a fait accompli. Stalin pushed Malinovsky and Tolbukin with daily demands, fostering rivalry between the two front commanders, accepting casualties that would have paralyzed any other army. 2 dictators, 2 obsessions. Between them, a city about to become an abattoir. Karl Pfeffer-Wildenbruch was 56 years old when he assumed command of the Budapest garrison. His career told a particular story, not of tactical brilliance forged in mobile warfare, but of institutional loyalty cultivated in the regime's internal machinery. Born in 1888, he had served as an Imperial Army officer in the First World War, transitioned through the interwar Reichswehr, and found his true vocation in Heinrich Himmler's expanding SS and police apparatus. He rose through the Ordnungspolizei hierarchy, commanding police schools, overseeing uniformed formations, holding inspector posts that placed him at the nexus of domestic enforcement rather than frontline combat. His credentials were ideological, not operational. He had never commanded a conventional military campaign. He had never defended a city against converging enemy fronts. Now he commanded 9th SS Mountain Corps and a polyglot garrison that embodied the Reich's terminal desperation. Waffen SS cavalry divisions, Wehrmacht infantry remnants, Hungarian regulars of varying reliability, and Aero Cross fanatics whose expertise ran more toward murdering Jewish civilians than holding defensive perimeters. Pfeffer-Wildenbruch established his command post in the fortified cellars beneath Castle Hill, where Habsburg-era stone met 20th century reinforced concrete. Signal officers maintained radio contact with Army Group South and, through them, with the Führer's headquarters. The bunker air hung thick with generator exhaust and tobacco smoke. Bare bulbs cast harsh shadows across situation maps that showed the perimeter contracting daily. His qualification for this command was not tactical acumen, but something the regime valued more: the unshakable conviction that Hitler's orders superseded military reality. He believed in the fortress doctrine with the fervor of a convert, certain that willpower could substitute for ammunition, that ideological commitment could replace logistics. that holding Budapest mattered more than the lives of the 70,000 men now under his authority. The regime had placed a police administrator in command of a soldier's battle. The order of battle for 9 SS Mountain Corps included 2 cavalry formations that embodied the Waffen-SS at its most ideologically committed: the 8th SS Cavalry Division, Florian Geyer, and the 22nd SS Volunteer Cavalry Division, Maria Theresia. These were not ordinary Wehrmacht units conscripted into a hopeless defense. Their institutional histories traced through years of anti-partisan operations across occupied Soviet territories and the Balkans, operations sanitized in after-action reports as bandit fighting, but executed as collective punishment against civilian populations. Both divisions had participated in massacres that contributed to tens of thousands of deaths, their troopers trained to conflate armed resistance with civilian existence itself. The Florian Geyer had burned villages in Belarus. The Maria Theresia, recruited largely from ethnic Germans and Hungarians, had conducted similar operations in the Balkans. Their war crimes created a particular psychology: men who could not surrender because surrender meant accountability, who would fight to annihilation because the alternative was the gallows. By late December 1944, these formations held the most critical sectors of the Buda defensive perimeter, concentrated in the Castle district, where medieval walls and Habsburg fortifications created natural strongpoints. Their elite status within the SS hierarchy guaranteed better rations and equipment than the Wehrmacht units scattered across Pest, but it also guaranteed something else. They would receive no permission to withdraw. To retreat would acknowledge that ideology could not overcome material reality. Corporal Ernst Waldmann had not slept in 31 hours. He crouched in a ground-floor apartment on Uri Utka, 300 meters from the royal palace, his MG-42 positioned to cover the cobblestone street through a hole his squad had hammered through the plaster wall. The original window offered too clean a firing line. Soviet snipers had already killed 2 men who made that mistake. The improvised embrasure provided cover while still allowing the barrel to traverse. The building had been a professor's home. Waldmann knew this because the professor's corpse still occupied the bedroom upstairs, killed by a shell fragment 3 days prior. No one had moved the body. The cold preserved it, and the living had other priorities. His fingers ached inside leather gloves that had cracked from exposure. The temperature outside registered somewhere below -15°C. He had stopped checking the thermometer on the second day because the mercury had ceased moving. Inside the apartment, breath still condensed in the air. They had burned the furniture for heat until the smoke drew mortar fire. Now they simply endured. The smell in the room was layered, plaster dust sharp in the sinuses, cordite residue coating the tongue, and underneath both, the Swedish rot from the professor upstairs that the cold could slow but not eliminate. Waldmann had stuffed tobacco into his nostrils the first day. By the third day, his brain had simply stopped registering the odor. A Soviet assault team had probed this street at dawn. Waldmann's MG-42 had cut down 3 of them before they reached cover. The bodies remained where they fell, dark shapes in the gray morning light, already dusted with fresh snow. Soviet snipers covered them now, waiting for Germans to attempt collection of weapons or documents. The bodies would stay there until spring thaw, or until the next artillery barrage scattered them. Waldmann calculated ammunition, 4 belts remaining, perhaps 900 rounds, at the sustained rate required to break an infantry assault. That represented less than 3 minutes of continuous fire. 3 minutes. That was the margin between holding this position and hand-to-hand fighting in the stairwell. The reduction of Pest began in the first week of January 1945 with the systematic application of Soviet urban warfare doctrine. Malinovsky's Second Ukrainian Front did not storm the eastern city. They dismantled it. Artillery batteries established firing solutions for entire blocks, then obliterated them according to timetables coordinated with infantry advance. The process was less an assault than a demolition project with defenders. Soviet combined arms assault groups operated in standardized formations. a rifle platoon reinforced with engineers carrying satchel charges, a flamethrower team, and direct fire support from either a self-propelled gun or tank positioned to blast through walls at point-blank range. These groups advanced building by building, floor by floor. Engineers breached cellar walls where German defenders sheltered. Flamethrower operators cleared upper stories where snipers nested. The SPGs created new doorways through load-bearing walls with high explosive rounds. The lessons accumulated. Officers documented what worked. Isolation of strongpoints before assault, overwhelming preparatory fire to break defender morale, methodical clearance sequences that minimized friendly casualties. What emerged was not improvisation, but industrial process. Urban warfare reduced to repeatable steps. By January 18th, German positions in central Pest had become untenable. Pfeffer-Wildenbruch authorized withdrawal across the Danube bridges to the Buda side. The retreat was not organized maneuver, but fighting extraction through ruins. Each block surrendered only after Soviet assault groups had paid in blood and time. Gefreiter Hans Löffler ran. The apartment block on Rákóczi út had become a crematorium. Soviet assault guns had punched 3 holes through the facade in the past hour, and now the upper floors burned. Flames licked through shattered windows, casting orange light across the smoke that filled the stairwell. Löffler descended by feel, one hand on the banister, the other clutching his carabiner 98K with 4 remaining rounds. The heat descended with him. 3rd floor, breathable, though the smoke stung his eyes until tears streamed. 2nd floor, the ceiling radiated warmth, and he heard the wooden joists cracking overhead. 1st floor, the air scorched his throat with each inhale. He burst into the street and immediately threw himself behind a rubble pile. The cold hit like a physical blow after the inferno above, the temperature differential enough to make his lungs seize. He gasped, vision swimming as his sweat-soaked uniform began to freeze against his skin. The street was a gallery of destruction. 3 Soviet T-34s sat burning 50 meters to his left, victims of a Panzerfaust ambush that had cost 8 German lives. Their fuel fires illuminated the scene in shifting yellow and black. Beside them, a horse's carcass lay eviscerated, its intestines strung across the cobblestones where a shell had caught it mid-stride. Someone had already carved the hindquarters away. Löffler needed to reach the Elizabeth Bridge, 2 kilometers east. The withdrawal order had come 3 hours ago, but Soviet infiltration teams had cut the direct route, forcing survivors to navigate through side streets and courtyards. He had lost his squad somewhere in the last building, separated by a collapsing floor that had dropped 3 men into the cellar. He began moving, staying low, using the burning tanks as cover against the Soviet positions to the east. The snow on the ground had been churned to gray slush by boots and tracks and blood. A Hungarian soldier lay face down in the muck, his back opened by shrapnel, the exposed spine glinting white in the firelight. The Elizabeth Bridge was 2 kilometers away. It might as well have been on the moon. The compression into Buda drove the garrison beneath the surface. Budapest's sewer network offered what the shattered streets could not: covered lateral movement between defensive positions. By early February, German and Hungarian troops had mapped sections of the subterranean system, establishing routes through main collectors and service tunnels that connected strongpoints without exposure to the artillery storm overhead. What began as expedient became doctrine. Entire squads moved through passages engineered for wastewater, not soldiers. The sewers transformed urban warfare into something without precedent. Engagements fought in absolute darkness, in spaces that absorbed sound unpredictably, where the splash of a boot might echo for 50 meters or vanish into side passages. Soviet countermeasures evolved in response. Engineers identified main collectors the Germans used for transit and sealed exits with rubble and mines. Ambush teams waited at key junctions, listening for movement through the water. Some accounts describe attempts to flood sections, opening valves, diverting water mains, creating sudden torrents in passages already knee-deep. Unterscharführer Dieter Brandt had been underground for 6 hours. The sewer collector beneath Attila Ut measured perhaps 1.5 meters in diameter, Wide enough to walk hunched, narrow enough that his shoulders brushed the slick brick walls with every step. The water reached mid-thigh. Cold enough to numb his legs completely after the first hour, flowing with a current that alternately helped and hindered movement depending on direction. His squad, what remained of it, moved in single file. Brandt at point, then Rottenführer Meyer with the MG-34, then 3 riflemen whose names he had learned only yesterday when they were assigned as replacements. Behind them, somewhere in the darkness, a Hungarian pioneer unit was supposed to be following at 50-meter intervals. Brandt had not heard them in 20 minutes. The darkness was absolute. Their single carbide lamp had died an hour ago when Meyer stumbled and submerged it. Now they navigated by touch, Brandt's left hand trailing along the wall, feeling for the junction point marked on a hand-drawn map he could no longer read. The right hand gripped his MP-40 above the waterline, though he doubted the weapon would fire after this immersion. The smell had become a physical presence. Raw sewage, yes, but also something else, the particular sweetness of bodies decomposing in water. Somewhere ahead or behind, corpses from previous engagements had drifted into this collector, and Brandt's boots occasionally struck yielding masses that he refused to identify. His stomach had emptied itself twice in the first 2 hours. Now there was nothing left to expel. Sound behaved strangely down here. Water noise masked footsteps but amplified voices. A cough would travel unpredictably, sometimes swallowed by the tunnel, sometimes echoing back from 3 directions at once. They had established a system. 1 tap on the shoulder meant stop, 2 meant advance, 3 meant contact, no spoken words. Brandt stopped. Ahead, perhaps 30 meters, a different sound, not water, not the settling of ancient brickwork, something rhythmic. Breathing, movement. He reached back, tapped Mayer's shoulder once. The column froze. In the darkness, Brandt strained to hear past his own heartbeat, past the water's continuous murmur. The sound came again, a splash, then another, the cadence of footsteps moving toward them. His hand found the stick grenade on his belt. Throwing blind in a tunnel this narrow would be suicide. The concussion would kill his own men as surely as the enemy. But the alternative was a point-blank firefight in absolute darkness, both sides firing at muzzle flashes. The ricochet of every round multiplied by the curved brick walls. The footsteps stopped. 20 meters ahead, invisible in the blackness, someone else was listening. On January 1st, 1945, IVSS Panzer Corps launched Operation Konrad the Fern from positions near Tata, northwest of Budapest. The forces committed represented Germany's final significant mobile reserve on the Eastern Front. Waffen-SS armored divisions, including elements of Wiking and Totenkopf, plus attached army infantry. SS Obergruppenführer Herbert Otto Gille commanded the assault, driving southeast toward the encircled capital with orders to penetrate Soviet lines and open a corridor to the garrison. The initial thrust achieved tactical surprise. German armor advanced through frozen terrain, overrunning Soviet forward positions, recapturing villages along the approach routes. Inside Budapest, radio operators intercepted fragmentary reports of friendly forces advancing. For men who had been fighting in rubble and sewage, the transmission sparked desperate hope. That hope lasted 6 days. By January 6th, Konrad I stalled near Bitske, approximately 20 kilometers from the city. Soviet reinforcements materialized faster than German intelligence had predicted. The 3rd Ukrainian Front's reserves proved deeper than anticipated, and Tolbukin committed fresh rifle divisions to seal the breach. What had begun as armored spearhead degenerated into attritional grinding in frozen fields, exactly the battle Germany could no longer afford. Every panzer lost in Hungarian snow was one fewer defending the Oder. Every liter of fuel burned here was fuel that would not reach the approaches to Berlin. Hauptsturmführer Kurt Steiger's Panther had thrown a track 3 kilometers short of Bixke. The incident occurred at 0340 hours, in darkness broken only by distant muzzle flashes and the orange glow of burning vehicles. The tank had been moving at speed across a frozen field when the left track parted at the junction, weakened, perhaps, by the sub-zero temperatures that made steel brittle, or by damage from a mine strike earlier in the advance that had gone unnoticed. Now Steiger stood in knee-deep snow beside 52 tons of immobilized armor, watching his company commander's Panther disappear over a ridgeline 200 meters ahead. The relief column could not stop. Budapest waited. His crew worked in the dark, breath steaming, fingers already clumsy inside inadequate gloves. Track repair under field conditions required jacks, towing cables, and at least an hour of labor. Soviet artillery had this sector registered. At any moment, the barrage could resume. "Get the jack under the forward return roller," Steiger ordered. "Hoffman, you're on the cable. The rest of you provide security." The loader, a 19-year-old from Saxony whose name Steiger had never bothered to learn, trudged through the snow toward the tree line, Mauser at the ready. The driver and radio man wrestled with the 70-kilogram track jack, their grunts the only sounds in the frozen night. Steiger climbed back onto the turret and scanned the darkness through his binoculars. The ridgeline where his company had vanished showed nothing. No silhouettes, no engine exhaust, no movement. They were alone. The cold was a living adversary. It crept through the seams of his tank suit, crystallized the moisture in his nostrils, made his eyes water until the tears froze on his cheeks. The thermometer in the turret had registered -22°C before they lost the engine's heat. A sound reached him, the distinctive whistle of incoming artillery. "Cover!" he shouted, throwing himself off the turret into the snow. The first shells landed 200 meters east, sending frozen earth fountaining into the air. The second salvo walked closer. The third bracketed the immobilized Panther, one round detonating 15 meters from the track jack, the concussion slamming Steiger against the tank's road wheel. When his hearing returned, the Saxon loader was screaming. The boy lay in the snow 30 meters away, one leg twisted at an angle that suggested the femur had shattered. Steiger ran to him, keeping low, and found what he expected: compound fracture. The bone visible through torn flesh and uniform, blood already crystallizing in the cold. Budapest was 20 kilometers away. The aid station was 6 kilometers to the rear. The Panther could not move. The next salvo was already whistling in. Hitler demanded a second attempt before Konrad I's failure was fully acknowledged. Konrad II launched on January 7th, shifting the axis of advance to strike from the north around Esztergom toward Buda. The terrain conspired against the attackers. Wooded ridges in the Pilis Mountains, where Soviet anti-tank guns waited in prepared positions. Valleys choked with snow that channeled armor into killing zones. Each kilometer cost tanks Germany could not replace. The offensive ground forward through conditions that turned tactical movement into ordeal. Panzer Grenadiers fought through fortified villages where every building had been prepared for defense. The advance measured itself in hundreds of meters per day. Konrad II stalled by mid-January. Hitler ordered Konrad III immediately. This time, IV SS Panzer Corps penetrated to within 25 kilometers of Budapest's outskirts. Garrison observers reported seeing the flashes of German artillery on the horizon. Radio traffic crackled with renewed urgency. Pfeffer-Wildenbruch pressed for coordination, for a simultaneous breakout to link with approaching armor. 25 kilometers proved insurmountable. Soviet forces committed fresh rifle divisions and tank brigades into the gap, reinforcing faster than Gila could break through. By late January, Konrad III had consumed another 100 panzers and assault guns. The relief force withdrew. Budapest remained alone. Oberscharführer Walter Riedel pressed the headset closer to his ears, straining to separate signal from static. The radio room beneath Castle Hill had once served as a wine cellar. Stone walls sweated with condensation despite the January cold, and the 2 kerosene heaters barely raised the temperature above freezing. Riedel sat at a field radio set, its dials glowing amber in the dimness, transcribing transmissions onto message forms with fingers so cold the pencil kept slipping. The traffic from IVSS Panzer Corps came in fragments, grid coordinates that meant nothing to him, unit designations he could not verify, reports of advances and casualties that blurred into statistical abstraction. But one element persisted across every transmission: the distance. 30 kilometers yesterday, 28 this morning, 25 at noon, 25 kilometers. He could walk that in a day under normal conditions. A Panzer could cover it in hours. But 25 kilometers of Soviet defensive depth, of anti-tank guns and minefields and rifle divisions waiting in prepared positions, that was different. That was the gap between hope and reality. Measured in burning hulls and frozen corpses along approach roads he would never see. Message from Army Group South, his partner announced, handing over a decoded slip. Riedel read it twice. The text was formal, bureaucratic, the language of headquarters staff who had never smelled cordite or eaten horse meat. Relief forces temporarily halted. Garrison will maintain defensive positions. Further offensive operations pending. Temporarily halted, as if Konrad III were a train delayed by weather. He looked at the situation map on the wall. A week out of date, the perimeter marked in grease pencil that no one had updated because the news only worsened. The red arc representing Soviet forces had tightened around the city like a noose. The blue positions inside it had shrunk to a shape resembling a malformed kidney, the western lobe in Buda, the eastern fragment in what remained of German-held Pest. 25 kilometers away, German tanks were burning. 25 kilometers away, the men who were supposed to save them were dying. Riedel began encoding the reply that Pfeffer Wildenbruch had dictated: "Garrison will hold, awaiting relief. Ammunition critical, food exhausted, medical supplies non-existent." The transmitter hummed as he keyed the message into the ether. Somewhere beyond the encirclement, someone would receive it, file it, add it to the daily intelligence summary that would cross a staff officer's desk tomorrow morning. The reply would come in the same sterile language. Continue to hold. Relief operations proceeding. The gap between 25 kilometers and 0 kilometers would remain infinite. Konrad III's failure marked the garrison's transition from siege to annihilation. By early February, the perimeter had contracted to a fraction of its original extent. Soviet forces had driven the defenders out of Pest entirely, compressing them into the western districts of Buda, Castle Hill, Giller Hill, the medieval warren of streets surrounding the royal palace. The Danube bridges, the last links between the city's halves, had been destroyed, either by German demolition to prevent Soviet use, or by Soviet artillery rendering them impassable. Supply had ceased entirely. Luftwaffe transport aircraft attempting to land at improvised strips in the city parks were shot down or turned back by Soviet fighters. Glider operations delivered token quantities that could not sustain 70,000 men. The garrison began consuming its horses, then its reserves of anything edible. Ammunition rationing reached crisis proportions. Some sectors received allocations of 10 rifle rounds per man per day. Artillery batteries had ceased firing anything but direct defensive engagements. The Florian Geyer and Maria Theresia divisions, the ideological core of the defense, reported combat effectiveness below 30%. The pocket was dying. Stabsgefreiter Helmut Kessler had stopped counting the wounded 3 days ago. The aid station occupied a section of tunnel beneath Castle Hill that had been carved from limestone centuries earlier, then expanded by Habsburg engineers, then requisitioned by the Wehrmacht's medical corps when surface facilities became untenable. The ceiling dripped with condensation. The floor, originally flagstone, had disappeared beneath layers of straw that were themselves now soaked with blood, urine, and suppurating wounds. 217 men lay in this space, arranged in rows so tight that Kessler had to step over bodies to move between them. The wounded occupied every surface: straw pallets, stretchers, bare stone where nothing else remained. Most had not been treated beyond initial triage. There was nothing to treat them with. Morphine had run out on January 28th. Sulfa drugs 3 days later. Bandages were being reused after rinsing in water that came from a hand pump well contaminated by sewage infiltration. Surgical instruments were sterilized by heating them over candle flames. When candles were available, Kessler moved down the rows, checking pulses, noting which men had died since his last circuit. The dead were carried to a side chamber and stacked until burial details could work, which meant never, because the burial details had been absorbed into infantry replacements a week ago. The smell in the tunnel was a physical barrier, gangrenous flesh, fecal matter from men too weak to control their bowels, the iron tang of blood in quantities that stained the air itself. Kessler had wrapped a scarf soaked in schnapps across his nose and mouth, but the alcohol evaporated within hours, leaving only cloth that absorbed the stench rather than filtering it. A hand caught his ankle. Kessler looked down. Feldwebel Brenner. He knew the name because he had performed the amputation himself 2 days prior. Had gripped him with remaining fingers, the others lost to frostbite before the leg wound. Brenner's face was the gray of advanced sepsis. "Water," Brenner whispered. "Please." The water ration was half a canteen per man per day. Brenner had received his allotment at dawn. Giving him more meant taking from someone else. "Soon," Kessler said. "Rest now." He pried the fingers from his ankle and moved on. Behind him, Brenner began to cry, dry, hitching sobs that the tunnel acoustics carried to every conscious man in the chamber. There was nothing Kessler could do. There had been nothing he could do for days. He was no longer a medic. He was simply a witness to the dying. On the morning of February 11th, 1945, Pfeffer Wildenbruch convened his staff in the command bunker beneath Castle Hill. The meeting was contentious. Officers who had enforced the fortress doctrine for 79 days now confronted arithmetic that ideology could not refute. Ammunition stocks would sustain organized resistance for perhaps 48 hours. Food supplies had been exhausted. The perimeter had shrunk to a few square kilometers of urban terrain, dominated by Soviet artillery positioned on Gellert Hill. Pfeffer Wildenbruch announced the garrison would break out that night. The order violated Hitler's explicit prohibition. No breakout was authorized. The fortress must be held. But the SS commander, who had embodied ideological obedience, now recognized that obedience meant certain death, while breakout offered at least the possibility of survival. The decision was made. Communications personnel received instructions to destroy radio equipment after the breakout order was disseminated, preventing any countermanding message from reaching the formations. Assembly points were designated in the Castle district. Formations would concentrate in narrow streets around Castle Hill, then push west and northwest through Soviet lines toward German positions in the hills beyond the city. The plan called for 3 assault waves. Approximately 28,000 men, the remnants of SS divisions, Wehrmacht units, and Hungarian forces, attempting to punch through in a massed nighttime thrust. The irony was complete. The ideologue had become the defector. The SS commander who represented Hitler's will now rejected it. The breakout order was an admission that the fortress concept had been a delusion from the beginning. Sturmann Franz Huber received the order at 17:30 hours. He was crouched in a cellar on Dies Terre, 200 meters from the royal palace, his carabiner 98K propped against a wall that had been shored with furniture, scavenged from the apartments above. His squad, 5 men remaining from an original 12, occupied defensive positions along a rubble barricade that blocked the street from Soviet infantry probes. The runner who delivered the order was a Hungarian teenager in an ill-fitting uniform, his hands shaking from either cold or fear. The message was verbal, not written. Assembly at 1900 hours in the square behind Castle Hill. Weapons and essential equipment only. Prepared to move on foot toward the western hills. Breakout. Huber felt nothing at first. Not relief, not hope, simply the absence of surprise. They had known for days that holding was pointless. The only questions had been when Pfeffer Wildenbruch would acknowledge it, and whether acknowledging it would come too late. He looked at his squad, Rottenführer Seidel, who had lost 3 toes to frostbite and could barely walk. Sturman Pelzer, whose hands shook so badly from malnutrition that he could not aim. The 2 replacements whose names Huber had never learned because replacements did not survive long enough to warrant names. "Pack what you can carry," Huber said. "We move in 90 minutes. Seidel laughed, a harsh, cracking sound. "Move where? We're surrounded." "West, through Soviet lines, toward German positions. German positions are 50 kilometers away. The Soviets have prepared defenses in every direction. We have maybe 30 rounds each." Seidel's voice had risen, approaching hysteria. "This isn't a breakout. It's a death march." Huber did not argue, because Seidel was correct. The breakout was not a rescue operation. It was not an organized withdrawal. It was 28,000 men gambling that mass would overcome Soviet defensive depth, that enough bodies thrown at the perimeter would force an opening through which some might escape. He checked his ammunition. 27 rounds in the carabiner, 3 stick grenades on his belt, a bayonet that had last been sharpened a month ago. His rations consisted of half a frozen horse heart, wrapped in newspaper, saved from the last slaughter 2 days prior. Enough to fight for perhaps 10 minutes. Enough to eat for perhaps 1 day. The temperature outside was dropping toward -15. Snow had begun to fall, reducing visibility to 50 meters. Good cover for infiltration. Bad conditions for wounded men who could not keep pace. Huber began preparing his kit. In 90 minutes, he would learn whether the gamble paid off. The columns began moving at 2,000 hours. 28,000 men and an unknown number of civilians, families who had sheltered in the Castle district, terrified of Soviet retribution, shuffled through the darkness in 3 assault waves. The first wave, strongest and best organized, included the remnants of Florian Geyer and other SS assault units tasked with punching through Soviet positions northwest of Castle Hill. Fog hung in patches between the ruins, mixing with smoke that rose from scattered fires. The temperature had dropped well below freezing. Snow continued to fall, muffling sound and reducing visibility to short distances. For the first hour, the breakout achieved tactical surprise. The fog helped. Soviet positions in the northwestern sector had been suppressed by the last coordinated artillery barrage the garrison could manage, and lead elements slipped through gaps in the line. Officers maintained noise discipline, hissing orders to stay quiet, to keep moving. Behind the first wave came the second, then the third, a human river flowing through the shattered city toward the western hills and whatever waited beyond. Rottenführer Konrad Meyer's boots found the cobblestones of Bexikapu Ter by memory rather than sight. The fog was dense enough to taste, wet, cold, faintly acrid from the smoke that drifted through it. Visibility extended perhaps 15 meters, far enough to see the hunched shapes of the men ahead, close enough to obscure the Soviet positions that certainly waited somewhere in the murk. His squad moved in column formation, 5 meters between each man to prevent bunching under fire. Meyer carried his MP-40 at port arms, 40 rounds in the magazine, 1 spare in his coat pocket. His total ammunition for the breakout, 80 rounds. His total rations, nothing. The last of the horse meat had gone to men with longer range weapons. The first wave numbered perhaps 8,000 men, concentrated on a front barely 300 meters wide. They moved through the ruins like a dark tide, weapons held low, breath steaming in the frigid air. No one spoke. The only sounds were footfalls crunching on frozen rubble and the distant thump of artillery firing blindly into other sectors of the city. Meyer had been in the SS since 1941. He had fought in Ukraine, in the Balkans, in the grinding attrition of the Eastern Front's later years. He recognized the particular silence that preceded catastrophe, the held breath before the trigger pull. The formation ahead of him stopped. Meyer halted, raising his fist to signal the men behind. In the fog, nothing moved. No sounds reached him except his own heartbeat and the faint whisper of falling snow. Then the first flare burst overhead. The magnesium glare transformed the night into harsh white noon, throwing long shadows across the rubble. illuminating 8,000 men caught in the open. Meyer saw, in that instant of frozen brightness, the Soviet positions they had not detected. Machine gun nests in the upper floors of buildings on either side of their route. Anti-tank guns positioned to sweep the street. Infantry in prepared fighting holes along the ridgeline 200 meters ahead. The darkness returned when the flare died. Then the shooting started. Szell Kálmán tear became the killing ground. Soviet artillery had pre-registered every approach to the square, every tram line and side street, converging on the natural choke point north of Castle Hill. When the German columns emerged from the fog-shrouded ruins, Katyusha batteries opened fire with calculated precision. The 7th Guards Army had anticipated exactly this route, had positioned machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire across the open ground. What little cohesion remained after the initial barrage disintegrated under sustained fire. Officers lost contact with their units. Companies dissolved into scattered individuals, fighting only to survive the next 100 meters. The fog that had offered concealment became a trap. Soldiers stumbled through smoke and darkness, unable to see more than a few meters ahead, running toward what they hoped was west, but often circling back into Soviet positions. The slaughter continued through the night and into February 12th. Soviet forces pursued scattered survivors into the hills northwest of the city. Of the 28,000 who began the breakout, fewer than 10,000 reached the wooded high ground beyond the immediate killing zone. Most of those would be captured or killed in the following days. The Budapest garrison ceased to exist. Schütze Wilhelm Krause did not remember falling. One moment he was running through Szell Kálmán tear, the cobblestones erupting in fountains of stone chips from machine gun fire. The next, he was on his back, staring up at a sky strobed by flares and rocket trails. His ears filled with a high-pitched whine that drowned everything else. He tried to rise and could not. His left leg did not respond. He craned his neck to look and found the limb twisted at the knee joint, the fabric of his trousers dark with blood that steamed in the cold air. Shrapnel or a bullet, he could not tell which, had shattered something critical below the patella. Around him, the second wave was dying. Men ran in every direction, their discipline gone, their formations dissolved. A Katyusha rocket landed 30 meters away, the detonation sending bodies and debris spiraling into the fog. The concussion wave pressed Krause flat against the cobblestones, drove the breath from his lungs, left him gasping like a landed fish. He began to crawl. The destination was meaningless. West, away from the Soviet positions, toward the hills that supposedly meant safety. His fingers clawed at the frozen cobblestones, hauling his body forward centimeter by centimeter, the useless leg dragging behind. Blood painted the stones in his wake, a dark trail that the falling snow would cover within minutes. The cold was numbing the pain. That was either a mercy or a warning sign. Krause had seen men with frostbite who felt nothing until the tissue was already dead. The blood loss would kill him before the cold did, but not quickly. He might have an hour, perhaps two, before consciousness faded. Around him, men continued to die. A soldier in Hungarian uniform knelt beside a ruined tram shelter, firing a rifle at muzzle flashes he could barely see. A burst of machine gun fire cut him down mid-reload. A German NCO tried to rally a group near a rubble pile, shouting orders that Krause could not hear, then collapsed when a mortar round landed at his feet. Krause kept crawling. 50 meters. 100. The square receded behind him, but the firing did not lessen. The Soviets were advancing now, mopping up the wounded, taking prisoners or shooting those who resisted. He could hear voices in Russian, shouted commands, the occasional crack of a pistol delivering a coup de grace. His hands found a doorway, a cellar entrance, its wooden doors blown inward by some earlier explosion. He dragged himself through, tumbling down 3 stone steps into darkness. The impact sending white-hot agony through his shattered leg. Above, the slaughter continued. Krause pressed himself into a corner of the cellar and waited to see whether he would bleed out, freeze, or be found. The 8th SS Cavalry Division, Florian Geyer, and the 22nd SS Volunteer Cavalry Division, Maria Theresia, ceased to exist as coherent formations on the night of February 11th. Both divisions had entered the siege with several thousand men each, veterans of anti-partisan operations, ideologically committed to the regime, equipped better than Wehrmacht counterparts. By the breakout, combat attrition and starvation had reduced them to fragments, companies down to squad strength, battalions down to platoons, the organizational structure maintained only by force of habit and SS discipline. The breakout destroyed what remained. SS Brigade Führer Joachim Rumohr, commanding the Florian Geyer, died during the attempt. Accounts vary between killed in action and suicide to avoid capture. His body was never recovered. The division's survivors, scattered across the killing grounds of Szell, Kálmán and the hills beyond, could not be consolidated. There were not enough left to form even a reinforced company. Of the roughly 30,000 men in Nyack's SS Mountain Corps, which included both cavalry divisions plus attached formations, approximately 800 soldiers reached German lines over the following days. The formations could not be separated in the chaos. The divisions that had committed atrocities across the Eastern Front were annihilated. Neither would be rebuilt. Unterscharführer Horst Wagner did not know where his division was. He knew where pieces of it were, scattered across the hillside behind him, lying in the snow in postures that suggested sleep, but meant death. He had passed perhaps 200 bodies in the last 3 kilometers, some in SS uniforms, some in Wehrmacht gray, some in Hungarian kit, all uniformly still. The snow was covering them, erasing their features, transforming individual corpses into white mounds that would not be found until spring. Wagner moved alone. His squad had disintegrated in the chaos at Szell, Kálmán, some killed in the initial barrage, others separated in the fog, one shot by Soviet infantry while trying to surrender. He had his MP-40 empty and his bayonet, and nothing else. The forest around him was pine and oak, the trees skeletal against a sky beginning to lighten toward dawn. Soviet patrols were somewhere behind. He could hear engines occasionally, and once the bark of a dog that meant tracker teams. Ahead, according to the briefing he had received a lifetime ago in the Castle district, German positions lay perhaps 40 kilometers to the west. 40 kilometers through Soviet-held territory, in temperatures that would kill an unmoving man within hours, without food or functioning weapons. Wagner kept walking. His feet had lost feeling sometime in the night. His hands, shoved into his armpits for warmth, had begun to blister from the cold. The exhaustion was a physical weight, pressing him toward the ground with every step, whispering that rest would be simple, that the snow looked soft, that no one would know if he stopped. He heard the voices before he saw the soldiers. Russian, 2 speakers, perhaps 20 meters ahead, beyond a thicket of brush that blocked his view. They were laughing at something, a joke, a shared cigarette, the casual camaraderie of men not fleeing for their lives. Wagner dropped to his stomach in the snow, pressing himself into the slight depression between 2 roots. The cold bit through his uniform immediately, but he forced himself to stillness. Movement meant detection. Detection meant death. The voices approached. Boots crunched on frozen ground. A flashlight beam swept across the trees, passing over Wagner's position without pausing. The soldiers moved on, their voices fading into the forest. Wagner waited, 5 minutes, 10. When he finally rose, his legs nearly buckled. The muscles had seized from cold and immobility, refusing to respond to commands. He forced himself forward. 40 kilometers, 1 step at a time. The division was gone. The war was lost. But Wagner was still alive, and while he was alive, he would keep walking. Of the 28,000 men who began the breakout on February 11, 1945, approximately 700 reached German lines. Not 700 from any particular formation. The organizational structure had dissolved completely. Just 700 individuals, filtering into forward positions over several days, arriving in ones and twos in small groups. They came without weapons, often without boots, frequently incoherent from frostbite and exhaustion. Debriefing officers noted that survivors could rarely identify which unit they had belonged to. The apparatus of military hierarchy had simply ceased to exist. Pfeffer Wildenbruch was not among them. The SS Obergruppenführer, who had ordered the breakout, was captured by Soviet forces during the chaos of the escape attempt. He would survive the war in Soviet captivity, returning to Germany in the 1950s. The commander who had enforced Hitler's hold-at-all-costs order until the final week, who had presided over a garrison through starvation and annihilation, outlived virtually all the men he commanded. The strategic objective that had justified the entire siege, the Naga-Kaniza oil fields, fell to Soviet forces in late March 1945. The petroleum wells that Hitler's fortress order was meant to protect were lost regardless, exactly as they would have been if Budapest had never been declared a fortress at all. 102 days of fighting, a city reduced to rubble, 2 SS divisions annihilated, a garrison destroyed. The oil fields surrendered on schedule. The numbers achieved nothing. Wagner saw the German positions on the morning of February 15th. He had walked for 4 days. He had eaten bark stripped from trees and snow melted in his mouth. He had hidden in haystacks, in abandoned farmhouses, in a drainage culvert beneath a road while Soviet trucks rumbled overhead. He had lost 2 toes to frostbite on the second night and felt nothing when they blackened. The German forward observation post was a farmhouse on a ridgeline, its windows sandbagged, a Feldgrau uniformed sentry visible in the doorway. Wagner approached from the east, arms raised, moving slowly enough that the sentry could see he was unarmed. "Halt! Identify yourself!" Wagner's voice emerged as a croak, his throat raw from cold and dehydration. "Unterscharführer Wagner, 8th SS Cavalry, Budapest Garrison." The sentry's expression shifted from alertness to something else. Pity, perhaps, or recognition of what Budapest meant. "Come forward slowly." Wagner walked the final 100 meters on legs that no longer felt like parts of his body. He reached the farmhouse and stopped, swaying, his vision beginning to gray at the edges. The sentry caught him before he fell. "Get the medic," the man shouted over his shoulder. "We've got another one from Budapest." Wagner heard the words but could not process them. He was lowering himself to a sitting position against the farmhouse wall, his back against sandbags that felt like clouds, his eyes closing despite his efforts to keep them open. Another one from Budapest. There had been 28,000. Now there was another one. Within weeks of Budapest's fall, front-level and army-level staffs began compiling tactical lessons for immediate application. Combat experience summaries circulated from the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts to formations preparing for the assault on the Reich capital. The documents cataloged specific techniques: combined arms assault groups moving through rubble in coordinated bounds, engineers breaching fortified cellars, flamethrower teams clearing upper floors, direct-fire artillery employed against strongpoints at ranges measured in meters rather than kilometers. The reports analyzed how fortress mentality collapsed once perimeters broke, how encircled troops became desperate rather than defiant when starvation took hold. Vasily Chuikov, commanding the 8th Guards Army that would spearhead the assault on Berlin, studied these summaries. His formations would employ identical assault group tactics, the same reduction methods, the same application of firepower that had reduced pest building by building. The Soviets had learned how to fight SS defenders who refused quarter and expected none. Budapest had been the laboratory. Berlin would be the exam. Captain Yuri Volkov dictated his after-action report from a field table in what had been a Budapest police station. The building's windows were shattered, the walls pocked with bullet holes, and the furniture had been burned for firewood during the siege. But the structure remained standing, which made it superior to most of the city. A junior lieutenant transcribed Volkov's words, the scratch of pen on paper punctuating the distant rumble of demolition, charges clearing rubble from main roads. Section 4. Tactical lessons applicable to future urban operations. First paragraph. The assault group method proved effective in reducing fortified apartment blocks when supported by direct-fire Su-152s at ranges under 100 meters. Recommend continued integration of self-propelled artillery into assault formations rather than holding them in reserve for counter-battery work, the lieutenant wrote. Volkov paused, considering the next point. He had commanded a rifle company through the reduction of the Pest apartment district on Rakoczy Út. His unit had cleared 14 buildings in 3 days, losing 31 men killed and 53 wounded. The Germans had fought from prepared positions in cellars and upper floors, using the building interiors as defensive layers that had to be penetrated room by room. Second paragraph. Enemy use of cellars for defensive positions requires dedicated engineer support with demolition charges. Cellar clearance without explosives resulted in unacceptable casualties from grenade exchange at close range. Recommend assignment of 1 sapper section per assault platoon, the lieutenant wrote. The lessons went on. Volkov had learned them in blood, his own men's blood, and now he was transcribing them into paper that would travel up the chain to front headquarters, to the general staff, to planners already marking maps of Berlin. The Germans in Berlin would use the same tactics. They would fortify cellars, position snipers in upper floors, create interlocking strongpoints along main avenues. They would make the Soviet army pay for every building in the same coin that had been spent in Budapest. And the Soviet army would pay it. They had the manpower. They had the ammunition. They had the will. What Volkov did not write in his report was what he had seen in the Pest cellars, the bodies of civilians who had sheltered there, caught between German defenders and Soviet assault groups, killed by grenades or burned by flamethrowers, or simply crushed when buildings collapsed. The elderly, women, children. Berlin would be the same. Volkov knew this with certainty. The tactical methods that worked did not discriminate between combatant and civilian. They could not, he continued dictating. The lessons would reach Berlin. The methods would be applied. The civilians of that city would learn what the civilians of Budapest had learned. The 8th SS Cavalry Division, Florian Geyer, was formally listed as destroyed, February 1945. The 22nd SS Volunteer Cavalry Division, Maria Theresia, was formally listed as destroyed, February 1945. 9 SS Mountain Corps was formally listed as destroyed, February 1945. Total Axis military casualties, Siege of Budapest, approximately 70,000 killed, wounded, or captured. Total Soviet and Romanian military casualties, approximately 80,000 killed and several 100,000 wounded. Total civilian deaths, Budapest, December 1944. February 1945, approximately 38,000. The Nagia Kanisa oil fields, justification for the fortress order, were captured by Soviet forces on March 28, 1945. Feldwebel Bruno Dietrich stopped walking. He did not know where he was. The hills above Budapest, somewhere, that much seemed certain. The trees around him were oak and pine, their branches heavy with snow, the forest floor a uniform white that concealed terrain and direction equally. The sky was overcast, diffusing the morning light into a gray brightness that offered no orientation. His unit was gone. His ammunition was gone. His rations had been gone for days. The frostbite had claimed his left ear and 3 fingers on his right hand. The flesh blackened beneath improvised bandages that were themselves frozen stiff. He had been walking for how long? The night was a blur. The barrage at the square, running through streets he did not recognize. Bodies in the snow, Soviet voices behind him, sometimes ahead. The forest had swallowed him sometime before dawn, and he had kept moving because stopping meant dying. Now he had stopped. The snow around him was unmarked, except for his own footprints, trailing back into the trees like a line drawn to mark his path for whoever might follow. Soviet patrols, tracker dogs, the men who would find him eventually, whether he walked or waited. Dietrich looked at his hands. The blackened fingers no longer hurt. They no longer felt anything. He tried to flex them and watched the joints move without sensation, like observing someone else's body from a distance. 40 kilometers to German lines. Perhaps more. He had lost orientation during the night, might have been circling back toward the Soviets, might have been moving parallel to the front rather than through it. The briefing in the castle district had shown maps, had indicated routes, but maps meant nothing in a forest where every tree looked identical and the sky offered no compass. He had the bayonet. He could keep walking. He could find a farmhouse, steal food, continue west until he reached friendly lines, or was captured or froze. Or he could stop. The snow did look soft. The exhaustion pressed on him with a weight that made each thought an effort. His legs had stopped shaking. Whether from adaptation or from the hypothermia setting in, he could not tell. Dietrich sat down against a tree. The bark was rough through his uniform jacket. The cold no longer bit as sharply as it had. Another warning sign, he knew. But the knowledge felt distant, theoretical, belonging to a version of himself that still cared about survival. He had been a soldier for 4 years. Ukraine, the Balkans, Hungary. A progression of retreats punctuated by occasional advances that meant nothing. Defending positions that were surrendered weeks later, killing men whose faces blurred together into a composite enemy. Now he was alone in a forest, without weapons, without food, without hope. The snow continued to fall, settling on his shoulders, his cap, his upturned face. It was lighter than he expected, almost gentle. Dietrich closed his eyes. The forest was silent except for the soft hiss of snowfall, and somewhere distant, the bark of a dog. Please subscribe for regular stories like this.